Hi, today we're going to take a look at the new Nikon AFP 10-20mm f4.5 to 5.6 ultra-wide lens. So let's start. Today we're going to take a quick look at the new ultra-wide zoom crop lens that was introduced by Nikon earlier in 2017. For the past 8 years or so, Nikon had the 10-24mm lens, which is considered to be a great DX lens, but it is quite expensive at close to $900. Nikon decided to make a much more affordable ultra-wide lens, and in this review we shall take a look at what sort of compromises, if any, this new lens comes with. As always, let's start with the build quality. When you consider the fact that this is made to be an inexpensive entry-level type lens, it is actually pretty decently made. It is mostly made from hard plastic, including a plastic mount, so be careful not to break it. The lens is very small at close to 80mm or 3 inches long closed down, and it does extend a bit to 85mm or about 3.5 inches. It is very lightweight, weighing 256 grams or 9 ounces with a hood, which we recommend you keep on your lens at all times, and has a filter thread of 72mm, so you can definitely use this lens with conventional filters. The lens has 2 rings, a relatively thick zoom ring which feels fairly good, and a very thin focus ring which felt surprisingly dampened, especially compared to the thin focus rings of other Nikon DX lenses such as the older 18-105mm kit lens, which feels really bad. What we found really strange is that this lens has no switches, no autofocus manual focus switch, and even stranger, no VR off switch. The new Nikon AFP 18-55mm VR also has no switches, and it is possibly another way to cut costs. This basically means that we have no simple way of testing the effectiveness of the VR on this lens, but Nikon does claim it gets up to 3.5 stops. Moving on to autofocus speed and image stabilization, the autofocus speed on our testing was quick, and on our D7500 test camera, review coming soon, we were able to focus pretty fast on both 10mm and 20mm. You might have seen our recent Velo Nikon to Sony autofocus adapter review, and we tested this lens on the Sony a6500 as well. There had been some issues focusing on smaller objects at around 10mm, but this should not really be a point against this lens, as it was not designed to work with an adapter or Sony cameras. As we have mentioned, testing VR on this lens is hard because there is no way to disable it, and to be honest, with ultra-wide lenses we need image stabilization less than on other longer lenses, but it's still nice to have. From our subjective experience, the claimed 3.5 stop stabilization seems reasonable. Moving from subjective to a more objective testing, we tested the sharpness in different apertures of this lens and also did a quick comparison to our older Sigma 10-20mm f4 to f5.6 DC HSM lens. So let's start with sharpness, and as you can see, the sharpness at 10mm in the center of the frame is very good, even wide open, and you don't see a lot of improvement closing down. Looking at the sides of the frame, you find the same result. Keep in mind that this specific test was shot at a distance of 3 feet or about 1 meter. If you look at a very high magnification, you can see that there is just a tad more chromatic aberration in the wider aperture, but the sharpness itself seems almost identical in all of these shots, which is truly surprising. We really can't recall any lens with a similar behavior. At 20mm, you do see a slight improvement in sharpness between f5.6 and f8 in the center of the frame, and about the same level of sharpness stays at f11 as well. On the side of the frame, we see an even bigger improvement between f5.6 and f8, and in this case there is also a tiny bit of improvement going from f8 to f11 as well. Compared to the Sigma, which is a little bit faster at 10mm and much larger and heavier, the sharpness is pretty similar, as you can see from this image. Moving on to CA, the lens seems to control chromatic aberration pretty well. The image that you are seeing on the screen right now is cropped heavily and was shot against bright sunlight, and even here the purple fringing isn't extreme, although we did encounter it from time to time. The lens seems to handle flare pretty nicely, which is not an easy task for this type of ultra-wide angle lens. Vignette isn't that relevant for a crop lens, and we didn't see much of a change in the corners when we stopped down with the lens on the D7500. In terms of barrel distortion, as you can see at 10mm the lens has quite a clear barrel distortion, which goes away as you get closer to 20mm, where it is practically gone. As for bokeh, this is a wide, slow lens, so bokeh, and for that matter background separation, isn't really what you're looking for here. Nonetheless, you can see how the background is rendered almost wide open at 10mm from a close range. The lens can shoot close object at 10mm from a distance of about 5 cm from the end of the lens, which is pretty close. So let's conclude this short review. The new 10 to 20mm lens is an interesting option from Nikon. It is a very small and compact lens, it is decently built for the price, it has image stabilization which is not very common for the category, and focuses quickly with a modern Nikon camera. In terms of image quality, we were kind of surprised to see that at 10mm the lens is as sharp wide open as when it was closed down. At 20mm there is still an advantage going to f8 or even f11, and in general the sharpness is pretty good. As for drawbacks, this lens is much slower, aperture-wise, than some of the other ultra-wide-angle lenses in its category, especially some of the lenses Tokina has in its line. This isn't necessarily a deal-breaker for a lot of users, especially if you're shooting on a tripod, but some would certainly want a faster lens for low-light handheld shots. The fact that you can't switch the VR off might also be a concern with a lens that you might use on a tripod often. In terms of pricing, as we have mentioned, this lens is meant to be as inexpensive as possible and is currently sold for just above $300, which means that it is less expensive than any other comparable lens in the category, and with the performance that we have seen in this review, it is certainly a lens that you should consider. So that was our look at the Nikon 10 to 20mm ultra wide lens. You can read the full review on lensvid.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more videos like this. See you next time.